Jai Gurudev. So, anyone has joined except us? Not yet. So, I'm streaming this one to let's see. Invalid. Let's try. I don't know what is happening. No. So let's start with the Guru Asuti of our Guru Parampara before entering into this weekly memorial studies. अगाध संशयाम्बोधि समुतरन तारणिं वन्दे विचित्रार्थपदां चित्रां तां गुरुभारतीम् सदा सदानुग्रह निग्रह गृहीतमुनि विग्रहो भगवान् सर्वासामुपनिषदा दुर्वासा जयति दैसिकः प्रथमः त्र्यंबका विहित संतति ताम्रपर्णीर सन्मौक्तिक प्रकार कांति विशेष भागः पूर्वे जयन्ति गुरुवो गुरु शास्त्र सिंधु कललोल केली कलनामल कर्णधाराः जयति गुरुरेक एव श्री श्रीकंठो भुवि प्रथितः तत्परमूर्तिर् भगवान् महेश्वरो भूतिराजश्च श्री सोमानंद बोध श्रीमत उत्पल विनिहश्रिताः जयन्ति संविदा आमोद संदर्वा दिक्प्रसर्पिणः तद आस्वाद भरावेश ब्रह्महितां मति षट्पदीम् गुरुर्लक्ष्मण गुप्तस्य नाद सम्मोहिनीं नुमः सदा अभिनवगुप्तं यत्पुराणं च प्रसीदमता हृदयं तत्परो उल्लासय मोद तद आस्वाद भरावेश ब्रह्महितां मति षट्पदीम् गुरोर्लक्ष्मण गुप्तस्य मोद संदर गुरुर्लक्ष्मण गुप्तस्य नाद सम्मोहिनीं नुमः सदा अभिनव गुप्तं यत्पुराणं च प्रसीदमता हृदयं तत्परो उल्लासय मोद संदर्वा दिक्प्रसर्पिणः तदा उभयामल अभिनव रूपा शक्तिः तदगुप्तो यो महेश्वरो देवः तदुभययामल रूपम् अभिनवगुप्तं शिवं वन्दे यः पूर्णानंद विश्रांत सर्वशास्त्रार्थ पारगः श्रीक्षेमराजः दृश्यादृष्टं मे गुरुरुतमः श्रीवसुगुप्त महागुरु सोमानंद प्रभु उत्पल आचार्यन् अभिनवगुप्तं नाथं वन्दे श्रीक्षेमराजश्च नमो निखिल मालिन्य विलास पटियसे महामहेश्वराय महामहेश्वराय श्रीरामाय गुरुर्मूर्तये जय गुरुदेव. After Guru Stuti, just Panchadevata, remembering, invocating the Panchadevata. Namah Karunya Dehaye Viraye Subhadantine Bhakti Gamyaye Bhaktanam Dukhartre Te Namastutute यस्य उन्मेषनिमेषाभ्यां जगतः प्रलयोदयः तं शक्तिचक्रविभुं प्रभवं शङ्करमस्तु महा नमः शिवाय सततं पञ्चकृत्यविधायिने चिदानन्दघं स्वात्म परमार्थ अवभासिन भास्यानं चित्रस्योऽहं साकारत्वमुपागतम् जगद्रूपतया वन्दे प्रत्यक्षं भैरवं वपुः रामानन्दसुन्दर पुरन्दर मोक्षमाल्यं मौलोहटेन निहितं महिषासुरस्य पादाम्बुजं भवतु मे विजयाय माच्युर्सिञ्चित् मनोहरम् अम्बिकाया सहस्रसा पुरुषा पुनातु वः सहस्राक्षुर्भगवान् सहस्रपाता गले अङ्गे घ्रीणमूले नयने च निश्चला त्रयो अपायामि यमपुरुषा उपासते ॐ सन्नो मित्रः संवरुणः सन्नो भवते हर्यमा सन्नो इन्द्रो बृहस्पतिः सन्नो विष्णुरुक्रमः नमो ब्रह्मणे नमस्ते वायु त्वमेव प्रत्यक्षं ब्रह्म असि त्वमेव प्रत्यक्षं ब्रह्म वदिष्यामि ह्रीतं वदिष्यामि सत्यं वदिष्यामि तन्मा अवतु तत्त्वाकारम् अवतु अवतु माम् अवतु वक्तारम् ओम शांति शांति शांति. जय गुरुदेव. हर हर. So let's come and I invite everyone for this memorial weekly study circle in the honor of our Gurudev. We are in the very first chapter. First chapter is going on, and this first chapter is early sources of ShavismI. We are in the last segment of last part of this very first and very important chapter from one of the best, one of the greatest work by Gurudev. So let's start from here. So here in this slide, we are just going to discuss one of the most important concepts. One of the most important concepts for understanding the historical development of Shaivism in particular and Hinduism in general. And that is the concept of syncretism. So this concept, the concept of syncretism, Guruji shedded light on it in the very first chapter. So before we begin, let us remember Gurudev. Let us remember one of the most important, something very important concept that is the foundation that he is indicating, he is giving reflections. And that one, Shaivism did not emerge suddenly as a complete religious system. It evolves gradually over the centuries through interaction between the different cultures, interaction between the different belief systems, interaction between the rituals and philosophies. So that was a evolution. So the process through which these traditions mix together is called syncretism. So that we are discussing here by the blessing of Gurudev. So here I'm just trying to explain how different traditions combined to form a broader Hindu religious system, broader Shaivite system here. So the first point is mixing of cultures. So this is the very first point. So the Indian subcontinent has always been culturally diversity. So there is a cultural diversity always on this continent. Even before the arrival of Aryans, many indigenous communities already existed in India, in the Indian subcontinent. And these communities had their own religious belief system, had their own rituals, set of rituals, sacred symbols, and the nature worship. So they are the worshipper of nature, the natural forces, and the tribal customs they got. Later, the Vedic Aryans entered India and they are bringing yajna, the fire sacrifices. They brought priestly rituals where the priest is the mediator between the god and the bhakta. And then the Vedic hymns, srots, the godlike Agni, Indra, Varun, they brought those gods. So here the question arises, what happened? What happened when two different cultures live together for centuries? Do they remain completely isolated? So the answer is usually not. And that very natural also. Instead, they interact, they exchange ideas, they borrow practices and influence one another. So this is exactly what happened in ancient India. So the indigenous tradition and the Vedic tradition gradually mixed together. So for example, I'm just giving you from the reflections of this very first chapter, the nature worship from the tribal tradition entered mainstream Hinduism. The fertility symbols became sacred religious symbols. The local deities were identified with the Vedic gods. So this mixing of cultures created a more complex and a flexible religious tradition. Then the second point is the historical explanation. that need to be understood. So this process did not happen overnight. It happened gradually. It happened gradually through the trade. It happened gradually through the migration. It happened gradually through the social interaction and marriage alliances also, and through political integration. That was also a major force. So the religious traditions survive because they adapt. If the Vedic tradition had completely rejected local traditions, it may not have spread widely across India. Instead, adaptation made Hinduism inclusive, flexible, and diverse. So this is one of the reasons Hinduism survives continuously for thousands of years. That was one of the reasons. Next point is the mutual influence that you can see on the slide. That's the mutual influence that need to be understood. It is very important. Influence was not one-sided. The Aryans influenced indigenous cultures, but the indigenous traditions also deeply influenced Vedic religion. For example, Rudra. Rudra was originally a marginal Vedic deity. Over time, he absorbs local and tribal characteristics. Eventually, he develops into Shiva. Similarly, the tree worship, the snake worship, the mother goddess traditions become integrated into the Hindu practices. So the question arises, why do religions absorb local traditions instead of rejecting them? If we contemplate on this one, then probable answer can be to become socially acceptable. That might be a reason. To gain followers, to maintain harmony, to adapt to cultural realities. Thus, religion evolves through dialogue with the society, dialogue within the society. So I can give you an example of Shiva. Shiva himself is perhaps the greatest example of syncretism. Shiva combines tribal elements, esoteric traditions, and Vedic theology, philosophical speculation, yogic practices, and tantric symbolism. This is why Shiva appears in many forms. Like you can find Shiva as an esoteric yogi, Shiva as a householder, grihast, Shiva as a cosmic dancer, the Natraj, Shiva as a destroyer, Pralayankar, and the compassionate Lord, Dayalu, Karna Avataram. So these multiple forms reflects the many traditions absorbed into Shaivism. Third point is a gradual integration. So now let us understand the gradual integration. So this religious exchange is usually slow, very slow. Over the centuries, different communities interact. Rituals merge. Symbols are reinterpreted, and the deities become identified with another. So this gradual integration creates continuity while allowing change. For example, I'm giving example of the Rudra. So Rudra gradually becomes identified with Shiva. local fertility cults become connected with the Shiv Shakti worship, Lingoni worship, and the yogic practices become the part of the mainstream spirituality. So this explains why Shaivism contains primitive symbols, philosophical ideas, ritual systems, and mysticism all together. The fourth point is the formation of Hindu tradition. That's very important point if we are discussing the syncretism. And it's a final and important step. Through syncretism, these traditions eventually contribute to the formation of what we now call Hinduism, the Sanatan. Hinduism is unique because it has no single founder, no single scripture, and no single historical beginning. Instead, it develops as a civilization thought. Civilization through cultural interaction, through religious adaptation, and the philosophical synthesis. This makes Hinduism highly diverse, regionally adaptable, and philosophically rich. So Shaivism in particular becomes one of the strongest examples of this process. If we do the philosophical analysis, so now I'm just taking you beyond history, from history to philosophy. So syncretism also explains why Shiva represents contradictions. Contradictions here means destruction and creation together. Asceticism and household life, grihastha and bairagi together. Terror and the compassion together. Form and formless, sakar and nirakar together. So these contradictions are not accidental. They reflect centuries of cultural blending and the reinterpretations. Thus, Shiva becomes a symbol of totality. He is total, the symbol of totality, the symbol of everything. So now, finally, we can have this conclusion. What we understood here, syncretism means blending of traditions, and Shaivism develops through cultural interaction, and the indigenous and Vedic traditions gradually merge, and this process contributes to the formation of Hinduism in general and Shaivism in particular. So syncretism is the foundation for understanding the diversity, flexibility, and continuity of Shaivism and Hindu civilization. Now I will take you to the next slide, adaptation of elements that is being revealed by Gurudev, where we will see how this process worked practically through the adaptation of the local customs, local symbols, and deities, local deities, into the expanding Hindu religious system. So, as we discussed in the previous slide about the syncretism, the concept of syncretism, which refers to the blending of the different cultural and religious traditions. Now, here we will examine how this blending actually happened in practice through the adaptation of elements from the indigenous and non-Vedic tradition into the developing Hindu religious system. So this is very important stage in the evolution of Shaivism because it shows us how Hinduism expanded by absorbing local traditions rather than eliminating them. Now the first point here, Aryans adopt local practices. So when Aryans entered the Indian subcontinent, they encountered highly developed local cultures and communities. These indigenous traditions already had sacred rituals, nature worship, fertility cult, tribal deities, animal symbolism, and yogic and ascetic practices. They already have this one. And the Vedic Aryans brought a different kind of religious system. Those systems are fire sacrifices and the priestly authority, Vedic hymns, and ritual centered worship. So they start including non-Vedic deities and the practices because there might be two possibilities at that time for them. First one was the rejection and the conflict, or second, adaptation and assimilation. So in India, adaptation become more important. So they follow the path adaptation and assimilation. They did not go to the path of rejection and conflict. So instead of destroying the local deities, instead of destroying the local traditions, the Aryans gradually adopted many indigenous practices. The examples we have already revealed that one, like a tree worship, snake worship, or sacred river worship, fertility symbols, etc., etc. So now the expansion of the religious system, we understood how this adaptation happened because religion is never isolated from the society. So religion evolved according to the social conditions, political realities, and the cultural interaction. If the Vedic religion had remained completely exclusive, it may not have spread across diverse regions of India. So adaptation allowed Hinduism to expand geographically, connect with the local populations, and absorb regional diversity. This is why Hinduism later becomes one of the most culturally adaptable religions in the world. The second point is the inclusion of the non-Vedic deities. So this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of Hindu religious evolution. Many local deities worshipped by the tribals and indigenous communities were gradually absorbed into the mainstream Hinduism. And we have example of Shiva and Rudra, what I explained earlier there. Now the examples of the third point is like an expansion of the religious system. So through adaptation and adaptation, Hinduism gradually expand beyond a limited Vedic priestly religion. Originally, Vedic religion was mostly ritual-centric, controlled by priests, focused on the sacrifices, but later absorbing local traditions, religion becomes accessible to common people. bhakti developed, temple worship grows, and the folk traditions survive. So Shaivism becomes especially important because it appeals to aesthetics, it appeals to tribal groups, philosophers, kings, and villagers. So this broad appeal help, helps Shiva worship spread across India. Now the cultural and the social importance. So why this expansion matters historically? This flexibility helped Indian civilization maintain continuity despite political changes, despite foreign invasions, despite regional diversity, because Hinduism was adaptable and it could absorb new traditions, it could reinterpret older symbols, it could preserve continuity while changing. So this adaptability becomes one of Hinduism's greatest strength. Now the fourth point is the cultural adaptation. So cultural adaptation, no religion survive without adaptation in the history of world religion. As society changes, religious practices change, philosophical ideas evolve, symbols acquire new meanings, and Shaivism is a perfect example of this process. Shiva changes historically from tribal god to Vedic Rudra to esoteric yogi to supreme cosmic deity. So this transformation reflects cultural adaptation across centuries. If we move towards the deeper interpretation, so adaptation does not necessarily begins religion. Sometimes adaptation strengthens religion, expands relevance, and increase inclusiveness. Shaivism becomes Shaivism becomes philosophically rich, and precisely because it absorbs many traditions. It allows Shiva to represent nature, represent consciousness, represent destruction, represent liberation, represent cosmic unity. The Shiva becomes a universal religious symbol. That was the thing. So we can conclude here. Aryans gradually adopted local traditions. Non-Vedic deities becomes integrated into Hinduism. This process expanded and transformed religion. Cultural adaptation helped shape Shaivism. So we can have final thought here. The adaptation of local elements transformed early Vedic religion into a broad, flexible, and inclusive Hindu tradition we know today. Now, let's come together in the next slide, Vedic Rudra. So, here we will examine the figure of Rudra in the Vedic tradition and understand how he becomes the foundation for the later development of Shiva. So, in the previous slide, as we discussed how local and non-Vedic traditions were gradually absorbed into the expanding Hindu religious system. Now we move to one of the most important figures in this entire process, and that is Rudra. So understanding Rudra is essential because he forms the Vedic foundation for the latter development of Shiva. So without Rudra, we cannot properly understand how Shiva emerges historically and philosophically. So let's try to understand. Rudra appeared in the even in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest Vedic texts. However, unlike gods such as Indra, Agni, Soma, Varuna, the Vedic gods, Rudra is not a central deity in the early Vedic system. Instead, he appears as fierce, dangerous, mysterious, and ambivalent. So this already makes Rudra unique. So he was unique from the Rig Veda period. So we need to understand, why do societies worship frightening gods? What is the reason worshipping the frightening gods? Rudra is a frightening god, dangerous god, mysterious god in Rig Veda. So possible answer, if we contemplate, it might be fear of natural disasters, desire for protection, or the respect for the destructive forces. So with this contemplation, let's start with the first point: fierce storm god. So Rudra as a fierce storm deity depicted in Vedic hymns. In Vedic hymns, Rudra is associated with storm. So he is associated with storm. He is associated with thunder. He is associated with disease. And he is associated with the wild natural forces. So ancient people feared nature deeply because a storm destroyed crops, and disease caused death, and the lightning appeared supernatural, the lightning strike. Thus the Rudra became a god of uncontrollable power. So Rudra represents the terrifying side of the nature. But nature is not only destructive. So a storm also, for example, a storm is not only destructive. A storm also brings rain. A storm also supports fertility, and it sustains agriculture in a way. Thus, Rudra's destructive aspect also contains creative potential. This duality becomes extremely important later in Saiva philosophy. So the religious philosophy of fear, we need to understand. We need to go more deeper. Ancient religions often worshipped dangerous deities because people feared what they could not control. Worship became a way to seek protection, a method of reducing fear, a means of negotiating with the natural forces. Thus, Rudra was feared, but also respected and worshipped. So, question arises here: why might fearful gods sometimes become more powerful than gentle gods? This is the question. If you contemplate on this question, then because fear creates emotional intensity psychologically, and this psychological dimension helps explain Rudra's importance. The second point, associated with destruction. On the slide is the second point related to Vedic Rudra. So Rudra is associated with destruction. In Vedic thought, Rudra causes disease, bring disasters, destroys life. But Indian philosophy gradually develops a deeper understanding of destruction, the real meaning of destruction. So we need to think, is destruction always negative? For example, forest fires. So forest fires destroy old growth but allow new growth. So every end is a beginning. So death creates a space for the new life, and the old systems must collapse for the transformation. Thus, destruction becomes part of the cosmic balance. This is the outlook to see the destruction. And this idea later becomes central to Shiva, the destroyer of ignorance, the destroyer of ego, the destroyer of cosmic cycle. So Rudra's destructive nature eventually gains philosophical meaning. Now come to the third point. Fear deities. So Rudra as a fear deities. In Vedic hymns, people often pray to calm Rudra, to pacify Rudra, to avoid his anger, to seek protection from the deities. It shows Rudra is unpredictable. He is very, very unpredictable. So unlike orderly gods connected to the cosmic laws, Rudra represents wildness. Rudra represents uncertainty. Rudra represents marginal forces. For example, in ancient societies, feared uncertainty more than anything else. Thus, Rudra symbolizes fear of death. Rudra symbolizes fear of disease. Rudra symbolizes fear of chaos. But over time, gradually, fear transformed into the devotion. Rudra evolved into a more compassionate figure. So this transformation later contributes to the development of Shiva. So compassion with other Vedic gods. So now comparing Rudra with the other Vedic gods, if I do Indra, the heroic warrior and king-like, and Agni, the fire god, the ritual centric, all the rituals through the Agni only. Agni is the mukh of the gods. And the Varuna, the cosmic order, the moral authority. These are the characteristics of these Vedic gods in very, very brief. But Rudra, the character is wild. The character is outside social order. The character is connected with the forest and the mountains. So this marginal position actually becomes important later. Why? Because it allows Rudra to absorb. Rudra to absorb what? The tribal tradition. Rudra to absorb what? The esoteric tradition. Rudra to absorb what? The yogic symbolism. Thus Rudra becomes more flexible than other Vedic god. So the historical transformation into Shiva. Now this transition we will examine together. Over the centuries, Rudra absorbs local deities, gains philosophical significance, becomes associated with the yoga and the esotericism, and gradually Rudra transforms into Shiva. Shiva retains Rudra's fierceness, Rudra's destructive power, Rudra's wildness, wild nature, but also gains the compassion, karuna, the cosmic significance, the philosophical depth, and the spiritual symbolism. So this transformation reflects the evolution of Indian religious system. So Now, if we think more deeply, Rudra's duality becomes foundational in Shaivism. So now it is destruction plus creation. So terror plus compassion. So wildness plus transcendence. So Shiva later represents the unity of opposites. So that's why this is the unity of opposites, how it came. So this is why Shiva can simultaneously be terrible and benevolent, esoteric and householder, destroyer and the liberator. So it can be both. So all these dimensions begin with Rudra. So we can think of this Vedic Rudra like Rudra is a fire's Vedic deity associated with storm, disease, and destruction. Feared yet worshipped, represents uncontrolled natural power and gradually evolve into Shiva. So I'm just putting final thought before going to next slide. Rudra is the Vedic seed from which the latter, more complex concept of Shiva develops. Now I'm taking you to the next slide, the attributes of Rudra. So in this slide, we will examine the specific attributes of Rudra and understand why his complex character made him ideal for transformation into Shiva. So let's come. In the previous slide, as we walk together, Rudra as a fire's Vedic deity associated with the storm, disease, and destruction. So now we move deeper. We go deeper inside into the subject by studying the specific attributes or the characteristics of the Rudra. So it is very important here because these characteristics later become foundational to the personality of Shiva. So in many ways, Shiva inherits and transforms the qualities of Rudra. So when we study ancient deities, we must understand that God often symbolizes natural forces, psychological realities, and the social fears, philosophical ideas. So Rudra is not just a mythological figure, but he represents wild and uncontrolled power of nature. So here I'm just putting forward 4 major attributes. The first one, the wild and unpredictable. The second one, healer and destroyer. The third one, associated with animals. And the fourth one, marginal deities. And now we will examine these together. The first attribute that is on the slide, the wild and unpredictable. So Rudra is wild and unpredictable. Unlike orderly Vedic gods associated with the social and the cosmic order, Rudra belongs to forest. Rudra belongs to mountain. Rudra belongs to wilderness and untamed spaces. This distinction is very important. So we already compared with the other Vedic gods like Indra, Agni, Rudra. We compare Rudra. So he was unpredictable, he was dangerous, he was outside civilization. So question arises, why are humans often afraid of wilderness? It might be due to lack of control, due to lack of fear of animals, due to lack of control, due to fear of animals, due to fear of death, and due to fear of uncertainty. So Rudra symbolizes nature beyond human control. It's what human cannot control, that part of the nature. So in ancient Indian thought, wilderness had dual meaning. It was dangerous, but also spiritually powerful. Forests were the places where ascetics, yogis, they meditate. Sages sought enlightenment in forest only, and the ordinary social rules disappeared there. So this is important because later Shiva also becomes connected with the mountain, connected with the cremation grounds, and connected with the isolated places. Thus, Rudra's wilderness later evolved into the spiritual transcendence. The second attribute is the healer and destroyer together. So Rudra's most fascinating characteristics, he is both. He is both healer and destroyer. At the first time, at first it seems contradictory because healer and destroyer together. So how can the same God destroy and heal? How it can be possible? But in Indian philosophy, opposites are often interconnected. For example, fire destroys but also purifies. Storms damage crops but brings rain. Death allows renewal. So Rudra becomes dual nature of the reality himself. In Vedas, Rudra causes disease but also possesses healing medicines. This duality becomes central later in the Shaivism. So Shiva eventually becomes destroyer of the ignorance, but also liberator and healer. If we go deeper and think of philosophically, that Indian thought does not always see destruction negatively. All the destructions are not negative in Indian thought. Instead, destruction is necessary for transformation. Without destruction, old structures cannot disappear. Renewals cannot happen. Growth becomes impossible. So this idea later appears clearly in Shiva's cosmic dance, Nataraj. Cycle of creation and destruction, Tantric transformation. Thus Rudra's destructive role gradually acquires metaphysical meaning. Now come to the third attribute associated with animals. Rudra's association with animals, this is highly significant here. Animals in ancient religion often symbolizes as strength, fertility, and instinct, as well as natural power. So Rudra's connection with the animal suggests a relationship with the tribal and non-urban tradition. Later, Shiva becomes Pasupati, Lord of Animals. So this title, Pasupati, reflects mastery over nature, power over life, and the connection with the wilderness. So if you think, like, why do many ancient religions connect gods with the animals? So many gods, they got the animal vehicles, partners. Because animals represented survival and the cosmic powers. That is the reason. And the tribal and the indigenous connections. This association also suggests Rudra's connection with the hunters, Rudra's connection with the forest tribes, Rudra's connection with the indigenous communities. Unlike priestly Vedic gods, Rudra belongs to the marginal spaces. This helps explain why Shiva later becomes popular among common people. Shiva worship spreads beyond elite priestly circles. Thus, Rudra acts as a bridge between Vedic religion and the indigenous tradition. Let's come to the fourth attribute, the marginal deity. Now, it is another very important crucial point. Rudra was originally a marginal deity. In early Vedic religion, Indra dominates, Agni dominates, Soma dominates, Varun dominates, but Rudra remains secondary. So, how does a marginal god eventually become supreme, become Mahadev? It's a very interesting question. So, this is one of the most fascinating developments in the Indian religious history. Possible reasons I can count for you: popular appeal, tribal integration, and the philosophical reinterpretation, and the association with the asceticism and yoga. Because Rudra was not rigidly fixed, he could absorb many traditions. This flexibility allowed him to evolve into Shiva. So, transformation into Shiva through these attributes. So, Rudra's attributes later evolved into Shiva's characteristics. Rudra's wilderness, Shiva transformed into the Shiva's ascetic yogi. Rudra, destroyer, Shiva, the cosmic transformer. Rudra, animal god, Shiva, Pasupati. Rudra, the marginal deity, Shiva, become the supreme god. Thus, the Shiva preserves Rudra's ancient power while gaining philosophical depth. So, Rudra's complexity reflects a deeper Indian worldview. Reality itself is a paradoxical. Life includes creation and destruction. Life includes fear and compassion. Life includes order and chaos all together. So Shiva later becomes the ultimate symbol of this unity of opposites. So if I conclude these thoughts, the attributes of Rudra. So Rudra is a wild and unpredictable, both healer and destroyer, connected with the animals and tribal traditions, originally marginal in Vedic religion, and these attributes later evolved into the character of Shiva. So I'm concluding with this thought: the attributes of Rudra creates the foundation upon which the latter philosophical and the religious image of Shiva is built. Now, I will take you to the next slide, Rudra and tribes. So, we will explore here about the Rudra's relationship with the tribe and the indigenous communities, and examine how these connections shaped the evolution of Shaivism. So let's come along. In the last slide, we studied the major attributes of the Rudra. Major attributes of the Rudra like a wilderness, destructive power, healing capacity, association with the animals, and the marginal position in the Vedic religion. Now we move to a very important historical and the cultural issue: Rudra's connection with tribal and indigenous communities. So here it is extremely important thought is being discussed because it helps us to understand why Sivas become closely associated with forests, mountains, wilderness, and ascetic life. How non-Vedic traditions contribute to the evolution of Shaivism. So we will explore the answer of these questions here. Let's come to it. Before discussing Rudra directly, we must first understand tribal religion itself. Ancient India was not culturally uniform. It was very diverse. Alongside Vedic society, there exists many forest tribes, indigenous communities, nomadic groups, hunting communities, and these groups had their own rituals, own sacred symbols, own nature worship system, own animal cults, and fertility belief, ancestor worship. So, so unlike Vedic religion, which was highly ritualistic and priest-centric, tribal religion was usually nature-centric and experiential. So, question arises: why would tribal communities feel spiritually connected to the forest and animals? So, it might be due to dependence on nature, hunting and dependence on hunting and survival, because they hunt, then they can eat, then they can survive, and the constant interaction with the wilderness. So this connection becomes important for understanding Rudra. So first point, link to non-Aryan groups. Now Rudra is linked with the non-Aryan or indigenous community. That is totally clear. In Vedic texts, Rudra often appeared as an outside settled society. He appeared in the outside settled society. Beyond ritual orders, the story of the Daksh Yajna, we all know. That story got a reflections. And then connected with the dangerous species. So this already separates him from the many Vedic gods. So most Vedic gods belongs to sacrifice, cosmic order, social hierarchy, but the Rudra belongs to wilderness, belongs to isolation, belongs to fear, belongs to marginal spaces. So this suggests that Rudra may preserve elements of order, elements of older indigenous tradition. So that's why many scholars believe Rudra absorbed characteristics from the tribal deities worshipped before Aryan's expansion. Now, the historical interaction between the Aryans and the tribes that need to be understood. When Aryan culture expanded across India, it interacted continuously with the tribal populations. This interaction involved trade, conflict, cultural exchanges, religious adaptation, and over the centuries, tribal gods become identified with the Vedic deities. And the indigenous practices entered mainstream religions. So Rudra became one of the major points of contact between the Vedic religion and tribal spirituality. So this is one of the reasons why Shiva later becomes popular among villagers, connected with the folk traditions and worship outside elite priestly circles. Now the second point, tribal worship. So Rudra and tribal forms of worship that need to be understood here. Tribal worship was often simple, often direct, and nature oriented. It emphasizes on sacred mountains, rivers, trees, stones, animals. Many early Shaiva practices reflect these tribal elements. For example, worship of stone and lingas, sacred groves, animal symbolism, and the cremation ground symbolism. So the question arises like, why do simple symbols become spiritually powerful? So it might because sacredness comes from the cultural meaning, not material complexity. That is the answer. So the forest as a spiritual spaces here, if we move towards the symbolism of the forest. So in Indian tradition, forests are extremely important. Forest symbolizes mystery. Forest symbolizes isolation. Forest symbolizes renunciation. And forest symbolizes spiritual freedom. Many sages left society and entered forest to meditate. Shiva. Shiva later becomes strongly associated with Kailash mountain, cremation ground, Himalayan wilderness. So this reflects Rudra's old connection with the tribal and non-urban spaces. Thus, wilderness becomes not merely dangerous but spiritually transformative. The third point, forest associations. So the idea of forest association now we are examining here. In settled civilization, society creates rule. Society creates hierarchies and the ritual systems. But forest represents freedom. It represents freedom from the social structure. So Rudra belongs to this liminal space between civilization and wilderness, between order and chaos, between society and renunciation. So this marginality later becomes spiritually meaningful. Shiva, Shiva's asceticism reflects this. He lives outside ordinary society. He rejects material wealth. He exists beyond social norms. Thus, tribal and the forest association later evolved into the philosophical renunciation. Now, the fourth point, let's discuss the outside mainstream. Now, it's the final point. We are here. Rudra exists outside mainstream Vedic religion. This is extremely important historically. Initially, Rudra is feared, marginal, less central than Indra or Agni. But paradoxically, this marginality gives Rudra flexibility because he is not rigidly tied to the Vedic ritualism. Rudra can absorb, he can absorb tribal tradition, he can absorb esoteric practices, he can absorb yogic symbolism, he can absorb the philosophical meanings. So eventually, this flexibility allows Rudra to evolve into Shiva. So question arises, why do marginal figures sometimes become revolutionary? Let's think. It might because they are less restricted. They are less restricted by the established system. And what happened with the Rudra in this case? Now we'll go for the more deeper interpretation here. The Rudras, tribal associations reveal an important feature of Indian spirituality. A spiritual truth is often found outside ordinary social structure. This idea later appears strongly in yoga, in asceticism, in tantra, in Shaiva mysticism. So Shiva becomes god of outsiders. Shiva becomes protector of ascetics. Shiva becomes lord of wilderness. Shiva becomes master of a spiritual transformation. Thus, the tribal symbolism evolves into metaphysical symbolism. So, the final conclusion, if we conclude this one, Rudra and the tribes here, Rudra is linked with the tribal and the indigenous traditions. connected with the forest, animals, and wilderness, represents forces outside mainstream Vedic society, and tribal symbolism latter contributes deeply to Shaivism. So I'm just giving the final takeaway here. Rudra's tribal associations help transform Shiva into a universal figure who combines nature, asceticism, philosophy, and spirituality. Let's come to the next slide, transformation. Transformation, we will study the transformation of Rudra into Shiva. Here we are talking the transformation Rudra into Shiva, nothing else. And understand how this gradual evolution reshaped Indian religious thought. So, in the previous slide, what we discussed, we examined together the Rudra's association with the tribal tradition, forest symbolism, marginal religious spaces, wilderness, and asceticism. Now we come to one of the most crucial developments in the history of Indian religion, the transformation of Rudra into Shiva. So this transformation is not merely the evolution of one deity into the another, but it reflects the cultural synthesis, it reflects the religious adaptation, it reflects the philosophical evolution, and it reflects the social transformation. So understanding this process is essential for understanding the rise of Shaivism itself. So let's come together to understand this one. Religions are never static. That's very important. Gurudev says always. Over the time, symbols change, rituals evolve, gods acquire new meanings, and the philosophical interpretations deepens. Therefore, deities are not fixed personalities. They evolve with civilization. Rudra's transformation into Shiva is one of the greatest examples of religious evolution in Indian history. Question arises here. Can a religion survive for thousands of years without changing? And the answer is no, not at all. The transformation survives. Transformation survives because they adapt while preserving the continuity. So I'm discussing here now the Rudra evolves into Shiva. The first point. Rudras gradually evolve into Shiva it's gradually evolve into Shiva, and then I will take you to the next point. Gains positive attributes. So and then third one that becomes central deity, and then finish with a cultural assimilation. So here, starting with the first one, Rudra is marginal. Rudra is fearsome. Rudra is associated with the disease and storm and worshipped mainly for protection. But over time, how transformation is happening. Rudra absorbs characteristics from the local and indigenous traditions, gains new symbolic meanings, becomes associated with the asceticism, meditation, and the cosmic power, and eventually Rudra becomes Shiva. But emphasize, it was not a sudden replacement. Instead, the old elements remained. New meanings were added here. So the traditions emerged gradually. The Shiva preserves Rudra's fairness, wilderness, destructive power, but also gains compassion, philosophical depth, cosmic significance, and the spiritual symbolism. Now, the why this transformation happened that need to be understood here. Several historical factors I can think of those contributed here. The first one is the cultural interaction. So Vedic and the indigenous tradition continuously interacted. Second one is the popular worship. So local populations worshipped deities closer to the nature and daily life. Third point, rise of esoteric traditions. So meditation and renunciation becomes increasingly important. And I'm not going to ask the Buddhism. And the fourth is the philosophical development. So Indian thought becomes more metaphysical and inward looking, introvert, inside looking. Thus, the Rudra gradually evolved beyond a storm deity into a cosmic spiritual principle. Now, the second point, gains positive attributes. So Rudra gains positive qualities. Originally, Rudra was feared, but later Shiva becomes compassionate, Karpura Gauram Karunavata, compassionate, protective, and the auspicious. So this is why the name Shiva, because Shiva means auspicious. Shiva means Kalyanakari. So this transformation is extremely important psychologically as well as philosophically. So here question arises, like why would people transform a fearful god into a compassionate deity? Let's contemplate on this question. Think for a while. And possible answer is emotional connection, desire for protection, a spiritual comfort maybe, and the religious evolution. So thus fear gradually transformed into the devotion. This is the transformation of Rudra into Shiva. And the duality of Shiva. However, Shiva never completely loses Rudra's fairness. It creates one of the most fascinating aspects of Shaivism. Shiva embodied contradictions. Shiva is destroyer, Shiva is benefactor, Shiva is esoteric, and Shiva is householder. Shiva is terrifying, and Shiva is compassionate. Shiva is detached, and Shiva is attached, loving. So Indian philosophy often embraces paradox rather than eliminating it. So reality itself contains opposites. Shiva becomes the unity of opposites. That is the beauty of Shaivism. Now, come to the third point, becomes central deity. So Shiva becomes a central deity. Initially, Rudra was marginal deity, marginal god in Vedic system. Later, Shiva becomes one of the supreme gods of Hinduism, Mahadev, the god of the gods. So this transformation reflects broader social and religious change. Shiva becomes important because he appeals to tribal communities, he appeals to esoterics, he appeals to philosophers, he appeals to villagers, he appeals to kings, he appeals to yogis, and he appeals to everyone. So few deities combine, and all the attributes after combining, it is you can find here all the attributes, all the positives here you can find in the Shaiva philosophy in Shiva within. So cultural assimilation, that is also one of the reason of the transformation from Rudra to Shiva. And that was very beautiful. Let's try to understand that one. How Shiva gains the universal appeal from the everyone. So development of the Shaiva traditions, Shiva becomes central. Shiva sects emerge. Temple worship develops. Philosophical school arise, and the Tantric tradition evolve. Shiva now worshipped ritually, philosophically, devotionally, and marginally. This shows how a once marginal deity, as a Rudra, becomes the complete religious universe. Now I'm discussing, I'm in a fourth point, closing this one, this transformation, the cultural assimilation. So Shiva's transformation reflects assimilation of Vedic religion, tribal beliefs, yogic traditions, philosophical systems, and fertility symbolism. So Shaivism becomes a synthesis of the multiple traditions. This explains why Shiva can simultaneously represent nature, consciousness, destruction, liberation, asceticism, and family life. So no single source explains Shiva completely. Shiva is the result of centuries of assimilation. So if we go more deeper, the transfer and try to understand the transformation from Rudra to Shiva, that is symbolize the transformation of the religion itself. Religion moves from fear to spirituality, from ritual to philosophy, from tribal symbolism to the metaphysics, and Shiva becomes not merely a god, but a symbol of ultimate reality. This latter influenced Upanishadic interpretation, Tantra, non-dual philosophy, and the yoga traditions. So now I'm concluding this transformation slide, that one, with the thought like the transformation from Rudra to Shiva is one of the greatest examples of religious synthesis and philosophical development in Indian civilization. Let's come to the next slide, the rise of Shiva, the important one. So here we will examine the rise of Shiva and understand how he becomes one of the supreme and most influential deities in the Indian tradition. Let's come. In the previous slide, as we examined together the transformation of Rudra into Shiva, and we saw how this process reflected, the cultural assimilation, the religious evolution, and the philosophical reinterpretation. Now we move to the next major stage, the rise of Shiva. The rise of Shiva as one of the supreme deities in Hinduism. So this rise is one of the most significant developments in the Indian religious history, because Shiva evolves from the marginal Vedic figure into a universal deity, into a philosophical principle, into a devotional focus, into a cosmic symbol. So let's contemplate on this one. Religious traditions do not become dominant automatically. For a deity to rise historically, several factors are involved. Those factors might be popular acceptance, philosophical depth, cultural flexibility, political patronage, emotional appeal. Shiva succeeds because he combines all these dimensions. Now question arises, why? Why do some deities remain local throughout in the history, while others become universal? Like Rudra was marginal in Vedic period and now transformed into Shiva and become supreme deity. Why? Let's think. The possible answers can be wider symbolism, ability to adapt, that is one of the reasons, emotional connections, emotionally people connect, and the philosophical richness. So Shiva possesses all these qualities. That's why it transformed from the marginal deity to the universal principle. Now let's go one by one. The rise of Shiva. The factors. First factor, first point, gains supreme status. Shiva gains supreme status. Initially, Rudra was marginal in the Vedic system, but over the time, Shiva becomes identified with the supreme reality itself. In later traditions, Shiva is not merely one god among many. He becomes Mahadev, the great god, supreme consciousness, the cosmic lord. So this rise reflects major philosophical changes in the Indian religion. Earlier, the Vedic religion focused mainly on rituals, mainly on sacrifice, mainly on the cosmic order. Later, the religious tradition increasingly focus on liberation, focus on inner realization, focus on meditation and metaphysics. The Shiva becomes central because he represents a spiritual transcendence. That was the reason. Historical reason for Shiva's rise. That can be several factors contributed, like popular appeal. Shiva appealed to the ordinary people because he was approachable, connected to the nature, and associated with the everyday life. Ascetic traditions. So Shiva becomes linked with the yogis and renunciants. Tribal and the folk integration. Local deities were absorbed into Shiva worship. And the philosophical development. Shiva philosophy becomes highly sophisticated. That was one of the reasons. And we cannot ignore that one, the political patronages. Kings and dynasties supported Shiva temple and the sects, the Cholas and Chalukyas and Pratyaharas, so many dynasties. So Shiva's rise was religious, social, political, and philosophical. Now come to the second point, worship expands. Shiva worship expands gradually, spreads throughout India. Different regions develop different forms of Shiva. Nataraja in south you can see, Pasupati in Nepal you can see, or Bhairava in Kasmir you can see, and a Linga worship across India. So this diversity reflects Shiva's extraordinary adaptability. He's a Nirakar, he is Sakar, he is in a form of Bhairav, he is in a form of Lingas. So unlike rigid system, here there is no rigidity. So unlike rigid system, Shaivism could absorb regional traditions while maintaining the unity. So the question arises, why adaptability important for the religious expense? Just think on this one. And the answer could be because different communities requires different form of expression, and Shaivism got this. So the temple culture and the pilgrimage, Shaiva worship expand through the temples, emerges, pilgrimages, tradition grows, and the sacred geography develops. For example, like a Kasi or Kedarnath, Somnath, like 12 Jyotirlingas. So these centers become religious institutions, basically. Cultural centers, philosophical schools, they are the philosophical schools. So the temple worships also changes the religion itself. And earlier, Vedic religion focused mainly on the sacrifices, no temple culture. Now, devotion, the bhakti becomes increasingly important. Now come to the third point, the integration into the Shaivism, integration into the Hinduism. So now Shiva becomes integrated into the broader Hindu framework. He is connected with the Brahma, creator, Vishnu, preserver, and then he becomes the destroyer, Shiva, the destroyer, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, Trimurti concept. Now it is Shiva becomes fully integrated into the broader framework of Hinduism. So Shiva is no longer outside the system now. He is part of the system now. And he becomes central to the central to cosmology itself. So at the same time, folk traditions survive, tribal elements survive, philosophical interpretation depends, and thus Shaivism remains both. Both, first the popular religion, and second the philosophical system. Now come to the fourth point, the popular devotion. Shiva becomes deeply connected with bhakti tradition. People worship Shiva as protector, worship Shiva as a compassionate God, worship Shiva as a personal deity, worship Shiva as a liberator. So here the question arises, why do devotional traditions become so powerful? Because it creates emotional connection. It creates personal spirituality and the direct religious experience. And the Shiva's personality supports devotion because he appears accessible, he appears compassionate and emotionally relatable. Even though he is cosmic and the transcendent, he remains close to the ordinary people. That was the reason. So Shiva's rise reflects a major transformation in Indian religion, from the external ritual towards the inner spirituality. Shiva becomes symbol of transcendence. Shiva becomes master of yogi, the Adi yogi, and the cosmic consciousness, source of liberation. This allows Shaivism to develop metaphysics, Shaivism to develop mysticism, Shaivism to develop Tantra, and Shaivism to develop non-dual philosophy. Thus, Shiva evolves far beyond this Vedic origins. Now, Shiva as a universal symbol. By this stage, Shiva symbolizes nature. Shiva symbolizes destruction. Shiva symbolizes renewal. Shiva symbolizes asceticism. And Shiva symbolizes cosmic unity as well as spiritual freedom. So this universal symbolism explains why Shiva remains relevant across centuries and cultures. I'm concluding this one with the final takeaway for this rise of Shiva. The rise of Shiva represents one of the greatest religious transformations in Indian civilization, combining popular devotion, philosophical depth, and the cultural synthesis. Let's come in the Upanishadic influence. So we will examine here the influence of the Upanishads and see how philosophical thought transforms Shaivism into a deeper metaphysical tradition. Let's come together. As we discussed, it's like how much time? So can we stop today? Yeah. So we will just we will stop here. Upanishadic influence I'll do next time. And I'm just closing this one, this great lecture, this great memorial lecture by Bhairav Astava, by Mahamaheshwara Acharya Abhinav Gupta Pad. Recite this one. Mata Bhairavastavaha व्याप्त चराचर भाव विशेषम चिन्मयमेकमनन्तमनादिं भैरवनाथमनाथ शरण्यं तन्मयचित्ततया हृदय वन्दे तन्मयमेतदशेषमिदानीं भाति मम त्वमनुग्रह सत्या त्वं च महेश सदैव ममात्मा स्वात्मयं मम तेन समस्तं स्वात्मनि विश्वगते त्वयि नाथे तेन न संसृतिभीति कथास्ति सतस्वपि दुर्धर दुःख विमोह रासविद्यायसु कर्म गणेषु अन्तक मां प्रतिमादृशमेन क्रोध कराल तमा विनिधि शंकर सेवन चिंतन धीरो मिशन भैरव शक्तिमयोस्मि हितस्मुकोदव भवमय संदे हितारित भूरित मिश्रः मृत्युयमांतक कर्म पिशाचर नाथ नमस्तु न जातु विभेमि प्रोदित सत्य विबोध मरीचि प्रोश्चित विश्व पदार्थ सतत्व भाव परामृत निर्भर पूरणे हमात्मनि निर्मिति मेमि मानस गोचर मेति यदैव क्लेश दशातनुताप विधात्री नाथ तदैव मम त्वयि भेद स्तोत्र परामृत वृष्टि रुदेति शंकर सत्यमिदं व्रतदान स्नान तपो भवताप विदारी ताप शास्त्र परामृत चिंता यस्यन्ति चेसी निर्मिति ताराम नृत्यति गायति हृष्यति गाढं संविधियं मम भैरवनाथ त्वां प्रियमाप्य सुदर्शनमेकं दुर्लभ जन्य समय दुर्लभ तन्य जनैः समज्ञं वसुरपौष्ये कृष्ण दशाम्यं अभिनव गुप्तः स्तवं निं करो येन विबुध भव मरु संतापम शमयति झटयति जनस्य दयालुः. Jai Gurudev. So I'm closing that one. Thank you very much for joining today. Jai Gurudev.